Welcome to the Plague Hive. After a bit of a hiatus, I'm back again today to bring you another Uzuri video. This time I'm joined by none other than Sebastian, aka Widwin, who piloted his unique spin on the Switchblade to an impressive second place finish in the Calling Antwerp, which is still the highest placed Uzuri finish ever in any big competitive event to date. The deck got its name Bluezuri because contrary to earlier Uzuri builds, it runs a lot of blues. Sebastian, why don't you run us through the deck? What was the idea in building it this way compared to the more established Uzuri lists at the time? Why choose to go for a heavy blue resource base instead of the more traditional, or let's say traditional-ish, redline based builds? Because your build doesn't run contracts or anything. It's still a stealth based list. You just chose to exchange the red stealth cards for blue stealth cards basically. So what's the idea behind that?
Yeah, hi. So when I started building Uzuri, I had two goals in mind. I started playing Azalea earlier, and while the deck was fine, it had some really, really bad matchups. Basically auto losses against Prism, stuff like that. So I wanted to avoid that with Uzuri. So one of the pillars of my deck is like as good a matchup against Stormeye possible. And the other pillar is like the Uzuri is a hero where you force the opponent off turns. And I want to be able to use as much of my hand as possible if I get to keep it.
Okay.
That's why it has a lot of go again and a lot of more blues for daggers and stuff like that.
Right. Okay. So basically the idea is you disrupt them with something like, Command and Conquer, Leave No Witnesses, Shakedown, anything like that. And then because they cannot play their turn as efficiently as they wanted to, your idea is to capitalize on that by then following this disruptive turn up with a turn where you can deal a lot of damage, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, right. Okay, so if we look at that, a lot of the choices in the deck make sense. Why don't we go over it top to bottom? Let's start with the equipment. I think there's not a ton of surprises in here. If you've looked at any Uzuri builds, this is basically like, I would say, the standard loadout. So you have your Crown of Providence as the head slot. Makes sense, you're not running a ton of contracts. You only have the Leave No Witnesses and the Surgical Extraction in here. So Mask doesn't make a lot of sense. And then I guess Crown of Providence is just flat out the best headpiece available if you're not on a contract plan, right? Would you consider ever running, for example, Skullcap in this type of deck, or does it the additional protection against CNC, the additional ability to cycle out a card, just have more value to you?
I mean, in general, Providence I think is better than Skullcap because getting that one free protection against CNC is important against a lot of matchups.
Yeah,
especially when you bring in some of your defense reacts. But if you don't have a crown, Skullcap is fine, I think.
Yeah,
get a lot of block. Yeah, but you need to use it as early as possible, I think, because a lot of the time you're actually up on life.
Yeah,
with this list. Yeah,
generally Uzuri Jin tends to block well, right? Like, I mean, most of our cards just block 3. And you want to block quite often because Uzuri has a lot of good 2-card hands, so you don't really want to keep 4-card hands if you can't convert them. So yeah, Crown of Providence makes sense. It's just natural at that point. Flick Knives, I've talked about this in earlier videos. It's a great card, really amazing addition to the Assassin's arsenal that we got from Outsiders. It's just a good card. It has synergy with Nerf Scalpel against defense reactions. Just a good card. There's not really that much to say. Like, you're not running any of the Flick Knife packages, right? Where you run stuff like Conceal Blade and a couple of extra daggers in the sideboard just to enable flicking more often. You do have more daggers here in the sideboard. We're going to talk about that in a bit. But I assume those are more for, being able to adjust to different matchups. You're not running Concealed Blade, so you're not looking to actually utilize those extra daggers you have in your inventory.
Yeah, but it's a little... The Flick Knife is obviously a good card, but in my list it's actually less good than, for example, in Redline, because you actually do not want to throw the daggers early, because you have all the blues to use them.
Right.
In some matchups, you kind of never throw a dagger, actually.
Okay.
Because you need to. Like,
You
for
need
example,
the daggers.
In Guardians or whatever, where it's PD in the end, or Dory or whatever, you cannot afford to throw a dagger away.
So even if let's say you are put in a position where you could flick a Nerf Scalpel to make an on-hit connect, let's say the opponent has blocked a shakedown with equipment for 2 or with a attack action for 2 because you hit them with a Spider's Bite, and then they play a sink below or something, so you could flick and make that shakedown actually connect. You still wouldn't flick in that situation if it's like, let's say, middle of the game-ish, not obviously very late.
Yeah, probably not. Like the default is not, but it depends. Like a lot of factors. But this list actually also has very few spots where you can use it. Like, for example, Contrast, a lot of overpours. The opponent uses a sink below against overpour quite a lot.
Right.
But with this list, a lot of your breakpoints are 6. Yeah. And often the opponent will block 3 plus a defense react for 7. Yeah. So
it makes it less likely you actually get that window to utilize the Nerf Scalpel. That makes sense, yeah. Okay, so basically you just run it because you might sometimes catch someone at lethal. So it just pushes the lethal range up a little bit, and it's a block 1, so it's basically just Iron Rod with an upside. Is that like generally the gist of what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. But sometimes we even... Were you talking about Big Knife still, or Nerf Scalpel as well?
I mean, both, I would say, in conjunction, I guess, because Nerf Scalpel is just typically the best thing to flick in most situations, right?
Yeah, but Nerf Scalpel, actually, you can just use it as well. Right. Double dagger and then attack. So that's why it's also important in matchups with V-Reacts. They can just double dagger, then they need to decide which one to block.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense, yeah. And in those situations, you would typically want to lead with the Nerf Scalpel, right? Like, assuming you have Nerf Scalpel and Spider's Bite. Because if you start with the Spider's Bite and then you attack with Nerf Scalpel, they can just block that with an attack action, get rid of the debuff. And I catch myself doing that all the time, like misplaying that, just leading with the Spider's Bite, simply because it's the dagger you attack with the most in most matchups generally. So if you want to attack with both, try to lead with the dagger that's not Spider's Bite. So start with the Nerf Scalpel, then the Bite, so you have a decent chance of actually getting both on hits to connect.
Yeah, that's right.
Because they're not going to waste a sink below on a Spider's Bite, right? Like, that's not going to happen. Then we got Tunic. I don't think I really need to talk about Tunic. I was really hoping that Dusk Till Dawn would make Shroud relevant, Redback Shroud, right? Because I was thinking, okay, having that card in Outsiders kind of makes no sense, because there's 0 cards in Outsiders that actually interact with Silver in any way. So it was kind of weird for me to see them giving Assassin a 3rd equipment piece that cares about Silver, and then we got nothing from Dusk Till Dawn for Assassin at all. So that was a little bit weird. I'm still holding out hope that we are going to get more support for Silver in a future set, and that's going to make Redback Shroud an option at some point. But currently, it's basically Tunic. I don't think there's any reason to ever run another chest piece in Assassin specifically than Tunic. It's just too good for us.
Yeah, that's right. Shroud has potential, but I think rather than needing Silver support, it needs attack reactions that you actually want to use.
Cost anything, that's true. Yeah. All right, so Nerf Scalpel, we already talked a little bit about this. You can occasionally flick it to get a defense reaction to go down and then go over it. But like you already said, you're usually not really looking to do that because you just want to keep the daggers up. Then Snapdragon Scalers, that's an interesting choice to run that in the main board. Is there a reason why you're running this over Black Tex? You actually do not have Black Tex in the list. I just saw that. Okay.
This deck doesn't really generate any silver, so you will not get 3 by it.
Yeah.
And while in some matchups, like blocking 1, and then basically having Snapdragon Scalers, like for example, Lexi, Phi, or whatever, might be better. It was not really worth the slot.
Okay.
And this list actually uses Snapdragons way better, especially also like, now it's not really relevant, but Ultim, Bravo, where you need to set up huge endgame turns that actually get blocked out early in the chain.
Yeah.
So you need to be able to give go again
reliably.
To a block.
I mean,
that's why I think it's way better than blackjack in this list.
I mean, I agree on those points. Like, I used to run Snapdragons in my list as well, but I had it on top of the blackjacks, right? So I used to run both. But it's interesting that you don't think it's worth the sideboard slot to actually include the blackjack whispers. I guess it makes sense because they kind of do the same, right? And you really don't generate a ton of silver. Like sometimes Leave No Witnesses can get you enough silver to get back like blackjacks once, and then that's already pretty huge if you can do that reliably. But I guess it makes sense to just be like, okay, I have one extra sideboard slot that I can utilize. Maybe what do you think with Oldhim out of the meta now? That you could exchange some of the Oldhim specific cards like Vambrace, take that out and then bring in blackjacks because it just gives you a little bit of extra value against a very aggressive deck like Lexi that just doesn't want to block.
Yeah, maybe. I don't think I will do that. Okay. Especially like, for example, if you're thinking about it, in the matchups Fi or Lexi, if I get to connect Leave No Witnesses, I'm kind of winning.
True.
So do I really need to buy back my boots?
Okay, that's an interesting take. So you see it more as a win more card rather than something that reliably enables you to get into that game state where you're ahead in the first place. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah. Okay, cool. I mean, for budget reasons, this is great, right? Like, I think everyone would prefer to run like a 10-cent common over a legendary that still costs like, let's say around 100 euros or so. All right, okay, Snapdragons. Spider's Bite, good dagger. Don't think we need to go over that a ton. And then let's go over a little bit the equipment sideboard that we have here. So you've got your Arcane Lantern, Nullrune Gloves, and Nullrune Hood. So you have the full AB3 included. And that's interesting to me. Is this for both Kano and Icelander or just Kano?
Yeah, because I have it, I bring it in to both.
Okay.
But probably it's more versus Kano.
Yeah.
But that's like one spot where I'm not sure if that's correct.
Okay.
Because Kano is already bad enough anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe you could free one sideboard space up there as well. But that's what I registered, so that's...
Yeah, makes sense. And yeah, this deck list, by the way, is the exact deck list that he ran at the Calling Antwerp, right? So this represents the deck specifically designed for that period of time. So we're going to go over a couple of ideas, what to change, what to take out, what to bring in at a later point in the video. As always, this deck list will be linked in the description of the video. So if you want to play this, you can just click that, tinker with it yourselves. If you want to run it on Talishar, give it a couple of spins. And yeah, that'll be available as always. So we got the triple Arcane Barrier, which, I mean, it makes sense. Like, you're on 18 blues, right? So you definitely have the resources to actually pitch into Arcane Barrier. And so it makes sense to have the option to just have AB3 and be like, okay, I'm going to cancel out the entirety of this Waning Moon. I'm going to cancel out 3 from this Ether Wildfire, you know, whatever, something like that. You have the option to do that, so.
And the blue thing from Icelander that discards if it connects.
Oh yeah, right. Like the Ether Ice Vein, yeah. Okay, then we got Orbitoclast, which I assume is also for wizards. Probably Dorinthia, maybe?
Wizards, Dorinthia, Dromai.
Dromai, true. That makes sense. Like, there's basically 2 schools of thought there for Dromai. Like, I personally, I'm not on Orbitoclast. Specifically for Dromai, like generally I don't run it in my list. I didn't have the space for it, but specifically for Dromai, I think I kind of like it when she blocks with the dragons. And attacking with Orbitoclast means she's disincentivized to block with dragons, but maybe that mindset is just kind of wrong. Like, I don't know, what's your experience with this? If you attack with Orbitoclast, assuming you actually attack her and not a dragon, do they still block with dragons sometimes? Or did you find that when you attack with Orbitoclast, sometimes they then start to block with their attacks more? Like, what's your findings there?
Like, the worst Dromai list is like big dragon Dromai. Yeah. How many attacks do they really got? So you really care about them.
Okay, that makes sense, yeah.
Not that many, and they need to block or they die.
Yeah, true. Okay. So basically the idea is you're hedging for the worst version of Dromai to face, and then if they're on something like an Empress redline build or something, you're okay, that's already a better matchup for me anyways. I can handle the fact that they're gonna block a little bit more with their attack actions, plus the Empress builds generally don't like to block as much, and they run a ton of 2 blocks, so okay, that makes sense, yeah.
I think you win versus redline.
Yeah, it's definitely a better matchup than Big Dragon Dromai, that's true. Okay, then Scale Peeler, which I assume was mostly an Oldhim tech piece. Do you run that into anything else, actually?
Not really. I tried it a little bit. I tried it against Phi. Can be okay, but the reason why it's in this list is Oldhim, and it's probably gone.
Yep, makes sense, yeah. And then Vambrace, I suppose, is also mostly against Oldhim. I could see this having potential applications into the new Prism, but I think that needs to be tested out if it actually makes enough of a difference to warrant running the card in your sideboard, because it's useless against anything else, currently at least. So we don't really know how relevant a new Prism is going to be in this meta, and we don't really know how relevant preventing 1 damage prevention is going to be against her. So I think this needs testing if Vambrace can actually stay in the list, or if you can just take it out and replace it with something different.
Yeah, for sure. Most likely it would go.
Yeah, I think so too. Like most, which is unfortunate because I pulled a Cold Fall one, and I would have liked to keep using that because it's a, you know, it's a pretty looking card. But yeah, I think ultimately it's probably gonna end up on the chopping block. All right, that's the equipment. So let's go over the deck for a little bit. Again, like this is mostly your standard Uzuri core, I think. You have like your typical swap-in cards, Command and Conquer, Red Death Touch, fantastic card. I love that. One of the best cards from Outsiders, in my opinion. You got your Leave No Witnesses, which is just a good 1-card hand, one of the best 1-card hands in the game. We've got Shakedown down here. We got Surgical Extraction, which also makes sense, is more of a like a late game swap that you can pitch away early and then still have some follow-up later in the game. We've got Codex of Frailty, sure, probably I would say the best card in the deck, at least in conjunction with some of the others, obviously. Like it doesn't really do anything by itself. But as soon as you have like a Death Touch in the graveyard, Leave No Witnesses in the graveyard, CNC in the graveyard, Codex of Frailty just enables you to have that much more disruption and that much more ways to force the opponent to have an off turn. So I would say these are pretty much standard at this point. I think almost any Uzuri deck is going to run those. So let's talk a little more about some of the little spicier choices that you've got going on here. So as the name suggests, Bluezuri, the deck runs a lot of blues, and those are mostly stealth cards. So you run Blue Isolate. Okay, again, that's core. I think every Uzuri deck runs those pretty much. But then you also have Blue Backstab, Blue Infect, Blue Sedate, Blue Wither. You run a lot of the blue stealth cards. So what was the idea there? Why use this approach over something like a redline stealth list that runs a couple of the attack reactions to enable those stealth cards to do something without having a swap target?
So blues, like we talked about, you want to use your daggers more, and then basically it doesn't really matter what the text is on these cards, except stealth.
Right.
You play this deck kind of like a value deck, and a lot of your best hands are like a 2-card hands. And for example, a playline that is very strong is if you don't have an arsenal, you attack with a blue stealth card and have some swap target in your hand, there's like nothing the opponent can do.
Yeah.
Either they block, and then you just arsenal your CNC or whatever, or they don't block, and then you get to connect it.
Yeah.
And you want to maximize these amount of plays, so it has a lot of swap targets and a lot of blue stealth cards.
Right. I mean, that makes sense, because that's really something that redline lists kind of struggle with a little bit. Like if the opponent just blocks, right? Like they just block 6, and you're holding, let's say, Command and Conquer, right? You have the problem that Command and Conquer in Arsenal is a lot worse than it is in hand, because you can't swap it in from Arsenal, and you're running so few resource cards that there's a realistic scenario where your next hand is all reds. And then you have to keep 3 cards to actually play, or 2 cards in that case. You have to keep a 3-card hand, including the Arsenal, in order to actually play that Command and Conquer. Or you need to have Tunic line up with it, that kind of thing. And the fact that you run a lot more blues means that you can just kind of naturally do that. And then the next hand that you draw is most likely going to have another blue. So you can block with 3 cards, play the CNC from Arsenal, and the opponent is left with the exact same scenario that they were the turn before. So that makes sense.
And one more thing, like one of the strongest things that Arachne already could do was dagger into CNC.
Off of
Tunic together.
Yeah.
And that's also why this list has a lot of blues, because that's just one of the strongest things you can do against a lot of decks.
Yeah, that's true. Like basically, hey, give me 3 cards, or your Arsenal dies and you take 6 damage. Particularly against Lexi, right? If she's holding like a 6-card hand with the double Arsenal, and then you hit her with a Command and Conquer, led by a Spider Spite, there's almost nothing she can do. Like she's losing basically 2 cards from her Arsenal or 3 cards from her hand, and there's not really anything she can do about that. So that's pretty nasty. Yeah, that makes sense. And then you talked a little bit earlier already about, having this kind of back and forth where you have a disruptive turn where you force the opponent to kind of lose cards, and then their turn is kind of less efficient than it could normally be. And then you want to follow that up with a turn where you yourself can keep a larger hand and then utilize that to the maximum. And I think the really spiciest tech, and that's definitely something that you've pioneered, that's been cropping up in a bunch of other Uzuri lists ever since you placed in Antwerp, is looking for a scrap. This is really, like, I think the really unique selling point of your list is looking for a scrap, which is, at first glance it looks kind of right? It's like a 1 for 4, blocks 2, not that great. It has this kind of weird conditional go again effect, but once you actually run all of these blue stealth cards, they all only have the 1 power. So as soon as you have one of those in your graveyard, looking for a scrap is suddenly a 1 for 5 go again, which is a fantastic rate. Or it can even be like a 0 for 5 if you have Tunic up, right? Like you can just do that off of no pitched cards. So you can do looking for a scrap off of Tunic into a stealth card that you then swap into like a Command and Conquer or something. And that is a really nasty 3-card hand that a lot of decks will have trouble keeping up with. So that was really a good tech piece.
That's just a good card. Like if you can reliably turn it on, it's one of the strongest cards in the deck, because it actually kills the opponent. It presents some of your best hands, like you can do 3-card 11 with on hit, which is really good. Like for example, of a blue looking for scrap into Command and Conquer.
That's pretty nasty. Like there's just a lot of things you can do with this card, and because you run so many blue stealth cards, you have more reliable ways to turn it on, right? Like I've seen some more hybrid oriented lists that run a bunch more contracts, but they typically don't run the full 15 blue stealth cards, because it's just, if you're trying to fit contracts in there, typically the first thing that has to go is some of the blue stealth cards, right? So you typically run like your isolates, and then maybe backstab, and then maybe one of the other ones. So you're on like 9 blue stealth cards or something. But having 15 obviously means there's a very good chance by the time you see that first looking for a scrap, you'll already have had an opportunity to get one of those stealth cards into the graveyard. So you'd never really need to worry about turning this on. It's basically almost always live. And in a pinch, if you absolutely have to, you can flick a dagger to turn it on. But I assume in your list that's almost never necessary, right?
Yeah, mostly you have a blue in your graveyard already. But yeah, sometimes you can just throw a dagger if you really, really need to. But most of the time you probably rather want to crown it away than
Yeah, that's true.
or
That makes
something like
sense.
that.
Yeah, you just crown it, recycle it into something else, and then if the game goes long enough, you still have that card that is very gas at a later time in the game. That makes sense.
I always had Looking for Scrap in my list, like since the day one, I think.
Okay.
But for example, it wasn't on 15 blues Dusk already, so I had Plunder the Poor at some point as well,
Yeah.
and then Blue Shreds and stuff.
Yeah.
But then you play a lot, and then you just realize, okay, it's not really that consistent with only 9, but the card is very good, so you want to make it more consistent, and also like Plunder the Poor and Reds, they're just okay cards. So
Yeah.
it's not really that bad that I cut them.
Yeah, like especially blue Plunder the Poor is kind of...
Oh no, it was a red.
I was a red one. Okay, right. Yeah, okay. It's okay. Like, it's a very reliable silver generator, I think. Probably the best one into a lot of decks. But it doesn't do anything by itself, right? Like, it's not disruptive in any way. And if it's like the only contract you're running, the fatigue aspect of milling a couple of extra cards also doesn't matter that much. So yeah, I can see why you were like, okay, let's cut this. It just doesn't provide as much utility to the deck as a couple more blue stealth cards would, because it just makes the deck more consistent, right? Like if your main idea is to be able to dagger a lot and then have a bunch of stealth cards so you can swap a lot, and then have a bunch of blue 1-power cards so you can use Looking for a Scrap a lot, those decisions all make sense in, you know, making the deck more consistent. So
yeah, just streamlined it.
Then we've got Enlightened Strike here. Also, I think that's almost a staple by now for most Uzuri decks. It's just a flexible card. You can do 2-card 7. You can have another source of Go Again in there. You can use 2-card, draw a card to reset your arsenal. It's a good card. It's never really a fantastic card, in my opinion. Like, you never have a turn where you're like, oh my god, Enlightened Strike was so good this game. You know, that almost never happens.
Can happen with Snapdragon Scalers. That's actually one of the reasons why they are better.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, true. It's one of the best Snapdragon targets. That's true.
Enlightened Draw is a really good play.
That's a good point, actually, yeah. I didn't think about that. Because I'm so used to playing with black text, right? Like, I only ever used Snapdragons really for Dromai, for Dash, because I just assume every Dash is going to be on like a pistol plan if they play against Uzuri, and against Oldhim, of course. And I think against pretty much every other deck, I just ran black text. But yeah, it makes sense. Like, if your main like leg item is Snapdragons, obviously, E-Strike draw card is also a play that's going to be live a lot more often. Yeah, that's true. And then we have, let's see, we have a bunch of more go-agains in the sideboard here. Let's go over these. We've got Hurl, which is just, it's a head jab, which has text that is very occasionally relevant. I'm assuming this is mostly for like these matchups where you need to go wide, right? Like, so your Dromai matchup, Oldhim matchup, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like the kill them matchups.
Yeah.
Kind of like Dromai, all the wizards. And also, yeah, you put them in as well, but you go up over 60 with Oldhim, so...
Yeah. You just kind of run everything into the old man. But fortunately, he's gone, so we don't have to worry about that anymore.
It's very important against Dromai and stuff, because I do not want any defense reacts and stuff in my deck.
Yep.
So I needed like 9 cards that go in.
To bring it to like a clean 60, yeah.
Yeah.
Then Give and Take, which is also just another go again. Like, the other choice in that slot would typically be something like a Ravenous Rebel if you're on a higher red count. But with 18 blues in the deck, I think Give and Take makes sense. Also, it blocks 3, which is really good, because it's like the only go again card apart from Enlightened Strike that we can run that actually blocks 3. And then you can do some pretty nice things like late game if you still have a Give and Take around. You can loop Codex of Frailty and Give and Take if you ever get into that situation. But that's kind of like more of a fringe thing, in my opinion. I don't know. Did that ever happen to you, actually, that you got into a situation where you could kind of loop these 2 cards? Or is that more of something that you kind of need Remembrance or something to line that up for you?
I mean, it for sure happened, but not really reliable. Often you just fetch a codex and then finish the game with snapbangers together in those matchups. For example, go like dash that with double dagger, they can't really block it all.
Yeah.
Give and take. I wouldn't really say Ravenous Rebel in the red line is similar to that, because it like hedges you against those fatigue decks. Like Ravenous Rebel is like a second hurl, or better hurl, maybe.
Better hurl, yeah, okay.
Yeah, in a red line list at least. Give and take. That's something a little bit different also. So it has like 2 modes. Like, just go again, you can kill a dragon, you can go white. But it also kind of forces 9 damage through in those fatigue matchups.
Right, yeah, okay.
Really important.
Because if they don't block it, they just take 3, and if they block it, you get a codex back, that kind of thing. And then you can play give and take again. So they're in the exact same situation that they were before. Yeah, okay, that makes sense, yeah. So it's just kind of like 9 free damage into anything that tries to fatigue you, and that can be pretty relevant, yeah. Then we got, let's see, let's head back to the main deck for a little bit before we talk about the rest of the sideboard here. So we've got Nourishing Emptiness, which might seem like an odd choice for some people initially, because outside of drawing it like turn 1, it doesn't really do anything in most cases. I guess maybe sometimes you can get lucky and do it like turn 2. You can do, you block with a blue stealth card, and then you do like looking for a scrap into Nourishing Emptiness. That would be a pretty sick hand, but I'm assuming this is mostly because it blocks 3 and it's a popper, and then very occasionally you just get it in your opening hand and you have a great start to the game. Is that correct, or do you have like any other lines of play with this?
No, it's exactly like let's talk about all the poppers, even like the yellow raging, if I may.
Yep.
So I wanted a good draw my matchup, as I told earlier. So put a lot of poppers. And at the start, it was just Nourishing Emptiness and Amnesia, just because they pop and block 3.
Yeah.
And then I realized I got a little bit hands that were too red heavy, so I wanted to replace 1 to yellow, like so. And now this is the difference. So it's Nourishing or Amnesia. And Amnesia also really doesn't do much, at least at the time. It may do more now, but so it was Amnesia or Nourishing Emptiness.
Right.
And Nourishing Emptiness actually hedges you a little bit, because going second for Uzuri is like way better than going first.
Yeah, I agree, yeah.
And so in the case that you go first, you have the potential, like 1 in 6 games or whatever, to just open up this Nourishing Emptiness.
Right, yeah,
which is just free value and can actually just, in the end, win you the game, maybe.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. So basically the idea is, okay, if I have to go first, which I generally don't really want to, I at least have the advantage of maybe I draw a Nourishing Emptiness in my opening hand, and then it's just basically 3 damage for free, plus I get to have the extra card, or they are forced to commit equipment on turn 0, which is really not something you want to do against Uzuri if you can avoid it. So that makes sense, yeah. Out of curiosity, did that actually happen to you at the Calling? Like, did you ever get an opening hand that had Nourishing Emptiness in it, and you were able to maybe win a game because of that?
I think I got it once or twice, at least, but I don't think it mattered in the end. But
okay.
Still.
Right. So it wasn't like game deciding, it's just like a nice extra bonus occasionally.
Yeah. I think I got it against Dromai, but it was a red line build and I won pretty handily.
Okay, that's pretty cool. Right, and then you already talked about Raging Onslaught, which is probably the card that was confusing people the most, because it's just literally a yellow 6 that has no text outside of some nice flavor, you know? But yeah, it makes sense. Like, if you just want to have a little more resources in your deck, you don't want just that many reds in it, and then basically all you care about is having another popper. Yeah, Raging Onslaught is kind of where you want to go with this.
The only other card in that slot would be like Feanor's Fighting Spirit.
Yeah.
And I tried it at first, but like we said at the beginning, you're often up on life in a lot of matchups. And because it's in the main deck actually, and you play it in every matchup, you block its stuff.
You just want the 3 block. Yeah, makes sense. Because I imagine like against specifically against Dromai, I guess Fighting Spirit does more. Because it's like you can sometimes get the health from it, because that also activates when you block a dragon and pop it. But yeah, if you're already up on life, I guess the FFS just doesn't do anything. And in that case, you're just, okay, the 3 block is just generally more valuable in more matchups. So that makes sense. All right, and then we finally have some of the remaining sideboard cards. So we've got some defense reactions, we got Fates, we got Sinks. That makes sense. 2 copies of Frailty Trap also makes sense, because that card is just nuts against Lexi. I would personally, I think, actually rate it a little bit higher. So I guess I would go like 3 Frailty and then maybe 2 Fate Foreseen, but I think that's just kind of personal choice. I guess it depends on how many Lexis you expect to show up. I don't know, like, how did you feel about Inertia Trap against Oldhim specifically? I know a lot of people took it out of their lists after some initial testing.
Yeah, Inertia Trap it's fine, but it doesn't really like.
Yeah, it doesn't.
You already blocked with a defense react, so you don't have really a white turn then. Then the not being able to crown doesn't really change much if you don't use double dagger and stuff.
Makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Wasn't really that impressed by it.
Okay.
Did a little bit. But I also would not cut the Fate Foreseen.
Okay.
Or
so you value the 4 block that you generally have more than the ability to kind of mess with Alexi a little bit more if you ran like the 3rd Frailty Trap.
If you have space, I would probably have, you can add a 3rd Frailty Trap, but I wouldn't do it over like a Fate Foreseen. For example, you could cut maybe 1 and put a Frailty Trap in whatever you want. But Lexi already is pretty good.
Yeah, it's already a pretty decent matchup for us, that's true.
Especially with the other card you've not talked about yet.
Yep, the yellow Death Touch. That's the last one we're going about. And yeah, that's also like, I know a bunch of people have tried out yellow Death Touch just because Death Touch is such a good card. You actually start thinking about running the yellow also, just because the effect is so good. And I guess specifically in a list that has more stealth cards than almost anything else, like apart from redline lists, I think this is like the most stealth cards that are run by any Uzuri deck, because you basically have like 9 plus the 12 here, so you're on like 21 stealth cards, and that's a very high stealth count. So having that means that Death Touch is almost always going to be live. So that makes sense. Just having 3 extra copies of an effect that's pretty disruptive. But what do you typically run this into? Because it's a sideboard card, so I'm assuming you don't just bring that into everything.
Yeah, funny enough, it was in the sideboard, but then I did the sideboard guide, and it basically went in every matchup.
Okay, right.
except for Lexi, where you only put in 1 and 2 Frailty Traps.
That's actually kind of interesting, because I imagine this card is probably the most disruptive into Lexi, actually. But I guess you also need more defensive options into Lexi, so I guess that makes sense.
Just don't have the space, because I also want the 6/4 defense reacts, and then I only have 3 spots left. And Frailty Trap is just more reliable, I guess, than Death Touch.
Okay, that makes sense.
And, later we maybe talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, we can actually, like this. I mean, this rounds out the deck list. I think we've gone over every single card. And if you have questions about anything, just put them down in the comments, or go to the Uzuri chat on the Fab TCG Discord. Ask in the chat. We're both in there, and we can try to answer any questions that you might have about anything of this. And so let's go a little bit over the matchups that we have here. So yeah, I can see the yellow Death Touch is basically a 3-off into everything. So this is almost a main board card. Yeah, I guess it makes sense. It's a good card into basically almost everything. Yeah. So is there anything here that stands out? Because I don't think we have to go over every single one of these in detail. But is there anything in here where you would be like, okay, this is like something special that people wouldn't really expect to see, right? Yeah,
maybe 60 cards against Dash.
Oh, yeah, okay, that's interesting. I guess it makes sense. Like, you go 60 against Dash because you just try to kill him as fast as possible, right?
Yeah.
Because, like I said before, I think you have to assume if you're sitting down against the Dash, you have to assume that they're going pistol. And they're going with a chamber full item build where they try to just drag the game out and fatigue you. And you need to have a deck that's as consistent as possible in order to stop that. So you just run the Go Against, you run the Yellow Death Touch. And I assume you're mostly pushing Blood Rots with the Death Touch, unless they already have a fair amount of pistol items out and you can do Frailty and just take a bunch of damage out of their turn.
Yeah, I think probably always like Blood Rot.
Always
sure, maybe
Blood Rot.
Sometimes like Frailty, but if you're in a spot where you need to Frailty because you're not about to kill them and they are about to kill you.
Yeah, okay. You're already kind of behind and it's already an uphill battle. That makes sense, yeah. Okay. And then I see you run over 60 in a bunch of matchups, but that also makes sense. Like Arachne, obviously, that's a fatigue deck. Bravo, I guess they can pretty reliably fatigue, so you're running over 60, right? Just to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Dorinthia, same thing. They're not necessarily a fatigue deck, but they can definitely play that way, especially against Assassin if they want to.
Yeah, better just play 62 there because I want all my defense reacts.
Okay, right. Just all of the directs. That makes sense, yeah. Just have as many of those as possible, okay. Then the Wizards, obviously, you swap out stuff and you bring in like the Go Again cards and then the Arcane Barrier stuff. Oldhim, obviously, is that the full deck? I think that's pretty much everything, right? Like you just run the whole...
not the frailty traps, yeah.
Right, no frailty traps, true. Yeah, okay.
But everything else.
Everything else, yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, so that makes a ton of sense. So just what you would kind of expect. Try to run a clean 60 into anything that you just want to kill, and then go a little over it for decks that might try to fatigue you, just to have like that extra little hedging against that. That makes sense. And then AB2 against Viscerai, that also makes sense, because if you lose the flick, you don't really need 2 daggers in most cases. Actually, it might be a little different for you, but I guess against Viscerai, you don't really get to keep a ton of blues a lot. And so you still don't really need a second dagger in most situations.
Yeah, but I'm not 100% sure this matchup. I haven't played too much against Viscerai. It wasn't really a common deck. So it might also be correct to just go AB1.
AB1 and then keep the second dagger in, I guess.
Yeah, maybe you can even go keep flick and put the no crown or whatever. I'm not sure.
Okay. Yeah, Viscerai, right, because you're running Nullrune Hood, right? So you have access to like a third piece of Nullrune equipment that you could switch in. And I think that's really a lot of lists don't run AB3. So they have a little less choice in this situation of what specific pieces they could bring. But yeah, it makes sense. Okay. All right. So we've gone over the deck. We've gone over the matchups. Again, like I said, if you have any questions, put them down in the comments. We can already kind of switch into the next segment and talk a little bit about how Dusk Till Dawn changes the deck. Or I guess more accurately, how it doesn't change the deck. Because unlike my predictions, we didn't get anything. I mean, I guess we did get the Surgical Extraction reprint. That's something, you know, fixing the mistake that LSS has made in originally printing that card. So it's a little more common now, and the price should drop a little bit, which is a good thing because Assassin is still one of the most expensive heroes in the game to build a deck for. So anything that brings that price down is a good thing in my book. And Dusk Till Dawn actually also has the Crown of Providence reprint. So that's another card that's reprinted that's going to make Assassin a little bit cheaper to play. So from that side, it's a good set for us. What it doesn't have is anything that's really relevant for Uzuri, right? So we can kind of skip over everything here because it's like all of the Prism stuff, Bolton stuff, Levia stuff, which I'm personally very excited about because Levia was like the first deck that I really got like heavily into. So I'm definitely planning to build a Levia deck and try her out and see if all of the new stuff that she got fixes the issues that she had. Jury's still out in that. Let's see how that goes. Vincent, obviously, pretty interesting. And I've seen a bunch of people that actually say she kind of plays a little bit similar to Uzuri, because her best plays are typically also 2-card hands, where she does like some rune gate thing and then something else, and then you have like some disruptive effect in her majestics. And these actually, they mirror the assassin majestics from Dynasty a lot, right? You have like the widespread annihilation, which banishes from hand, widespread destruction, which banishes from arsenal, and then ruin, which banishes from deck. So they're very similar to like leave no witnesses, eradicate, and surgical extraction in that regard. Kind of interesting design choice to make a rune blade that plays a little more defensive, a little more grindy, kind of like disruptive mid-range rune blade, as opposed to the more aggressive ones that we've had so far. So that's all pretty
for
interesting.
her Iron Maiden design.
Yeah, that makes sense. So she's more of like a tanky, I would say, rune blade, I guess, that doesn't necessarily play like as crazy aggressive as a chain, for example, would have gone. So we skip past all of that, and then we go down to the few cards that might have some relevance for us, and that's the generics down here. Like I said, Crown of Providence reprint, fantastic. That card has been expensive as hell. So this is hopefully going to drive the prices down a little bit and just make the game more affordable for everyone. That's a win in my book. Happy about that. This new suit of common equipment, I think, is basically unusable, at least in Classic Constructed.
That's the one that ticks down the armor.
Yeah. I don't really know what the idea behind that is. I could maybe see it in like a blitz list, right? Where you go, okay, I put this in if I'm going second. In case my opponent goes first and decides to attack me, I can block with it. And then I basically just have like some extra life in my equipment suit. But that's about the only use case I see for these.
I think it's against Reiner and Blitz, yeah.
Yeah, Reiner and Blitz, where you're just like, okay, there's a potential for like a 1-turn kill. So I have like an extra 2 or maybe 4 block in my equipment suit that I can bring in if I'm forced to go second. It's okay, it's not the worst. Or against a Bravo or Azalea, if they do like some dominate plays, turn 0, right? I could see this. But I think in Classic Constructed, the cost of putting that in your sideboard just outvalues any gains you could maybe get from it. So not really that relevant in CC. And then we have a couple of generic Majestics down here. We have these 6 cards. So let's talk about these for a little bit. Probably the most interesting for Uzuri at first glance is Censor, right? Because it's a swap target. It has disruption on it, at least in theory, and it still blocks 3. So this is like, I think if this was a 2-cost, 6-power attack, I could see it making its way into some Uzuri lists. Like, I would run that probably over a Nourishing Emptiness, for example, in your list, right? I could see that being something that you run, because the effect can be relevant into every hero. If you have like a good, a good predictive ability to kind of like sniff out what they might want to play next turn. And sometimes you can kind of, spot, for example, when a Lexi starts to block, maybe they're trying to play a 3 of a kind next turn, and then you can maybe use Censor to kind of get around that. But it's a niche card. I don't think there's a lot of use cases for it unless you have perfect information on the opponent's hand from something like hitting them with a shakedown or surgical extraction. So what's your thoughts on this card?
Yeah, exactly, but you would need like kind of go again on your information, which you don't really have. I mean, I guess some lists you can boots it, the shakedown or whatever.
Yeah, if you run
Black
Text.
Already hit a shakedown and then follow up with a Sensor, they will just block it because the turn is over anyway.
Yeah, that's kind of the issue with it. Like, the only thing I could see is maybe running something like, what's that one card? Like the Scout something, like the 0 for 3, where you get to see their hand if you play it from Arsenal. Hang on.
Frontline Scout.
Is that Frontline Scout?
Yeah, it's in Monarch Draft.
Right, yeah, okay. So Frontline Scout, maybe, but I don't think you would ever run Frontline Scout just to enable Censor. So it's just kind of like the card has too many hoops you need to jump through to actually make it relevant, to make it worth running. So I think that's just not really something you do. Then we have Mischievous Meeps, which definitely gets a prize as a card with a very fun name and fun artwork. But again, the effect is kind of interesting, especially against something like a pistol dash, where it's basically a must block, or against a wizard. If they run any items, right, like any potions or something, you can steal one of those. So that's pretty interesting. The fact that it's a 2-block and a 1 cost, I think, just kind of invalidates it from being playable outside of maybe Benji and Blitz. I think this card is not going to see a ton of play, and it's not really something that Assassin specifically is really looking for.
It's an interesting card. Like, it's kind of like a reverse give and take.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they need to block instead of not blocking.
True.
But yeah, only 2 power and 2 block probably makes it a little bit too bad.
Yeah, the 2 block is really kind of like a killer. If this was a 3 block, I could actually kind of see it played into aggressive decks, because they, like you said, it's almost a must block. But at the same time, like, you're not really keeping bigger hands against aggressive decks. So even in that scenario, it wouldn't be that good. So it's just kind of a weird card. Like, I currently don't really see a lot of decks wanting to run this because of the text. Again, outside of Benji. For Benji, this is obviously great, right? But that's pretty much it, I think.
You probably just not have the space.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
In a lot of matchups, it's not that good, and in a few, it might be good. You would need 3 slots in the sideboard for an okay-ish card.
Yeah,
I probably will get a playset, but
yeah,
it will be some time. I get some use, I guess.
Maybe at some point in the future, there's going to be a deck that makes this into a really useful effect. Or maybe we get a deck that really plays around items a lot, apart from Dash, right? And then this like gets a little more value because the effect is more relevant now. But yeah, currently in the current meta with the current decks that we have, I think this is not really something you want to pick up for Assassin specifically, but probably also generally not the greatest effect you can have. The next one is Hold the Line. And that's kind of an interesting one because it's a blue defense reaction. So that alone makes it a little bit interesting, right? But the text on it is kind of a little bit too restrictive to make it worth it, in my opinion. Basically, the only decks where this is relevant is Lexi with Art of War or Three of a Kind. And then essentially any deck that runs like Cash In, right? So any like a Royal Viserai, Royal Dromai, for example, or any Dromai that runs Tome of Fyendal with Mage Master Boots, that kind of thing. So any list that really has one of those packages, but even against those lists, you need it to line up with their turn where they actually draw all of those cards in order for it to do anything. So it's just, I think in my opinion, it's a little bit too specific in when you can actually get the full benefit from it. And then otherwise, a 2-block defense reaction is not really something you want to have in your list, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's even against the Royals, we would never run it because they only have like one use out of it.
Yeah, it's one turn where they draw something and you need to line it up perfectly with that one turn. And then specifically for your list, it would probably also take the spot of something like either one of the defense reactions you already have in the deck, or like, yeah, no, Sink Below is just way better than this. Like, there's no scenario where Sink Below is worse than this card, I think, in a general sense. Or it would replace one of your blues, which means one of your stealth cards. And then again, it's just not, it doesn't have the same utility. So again, just a card that I think you can kind of skip with Assassin. And now the next one is kind of interesting. Hack to Reality. That's like one that I could see maybe having some relevance if the version of Prism that ends up being played is like an aura focused build with Iris of Reality. If that ends up a thing, and I think there's a decent chance that there's gonna be Iris builds for Prism, at least in the sideboard, where you don't really want to bring in all of the heralds because you're playing against the Guardian, for example, and they have access to like tons of poppers. So I could see there being like prism builds that run Iris and a bunch of auras. And I could see those same builds also be used against Assassin, because I think we kind of struggle dealing with auras. It's not really something we're very good at. And then I could see this being relevant, right? Because it pumps up your daggers, actually. It just pumps your next attack. And then the next time you hit a hero this turn. And there's a couple of interactions with that are kind of interesting. Like, for once, the effect stays the entire turn. So if you hit them with a dagger, you can destroy an aura as long as it's cheaper than the power of that dagger. So 3 in that case. And so you can't hit a Genesis with it, but you could hit a Passing Mirage with it, for example, or a Burn Them All from a Dromai. Or, and that's the interesting part, the effect sticks around. So if the dagger doesn't hit, you can then like swap in a CNC and that hits. And if that deals enough damage, you can destroy an aura that way. And the most interesting part about it is the next time you hit a hero this turn. And I'm not sure about the interaction with Flick Knives on this one, because Flick Knives says that the dagger has hit, and I think that would count as a hit for Hack to Reality. So there is there's maybe some fringe interaction where you can play Hack to Reality, attack with something, flick a dagger, and then that kills something like a Passing Mirage. But I'm not sure if that actually works the way I think it would. So that needs a little bit of clarification.
I think the consensus is that it will work, but we can't really say for sure until we get the release notes.
Yep.
And then, yeah, sure, you can flick a dagger to get rid of one of the one-cost Spectre auras.
Mm-hmm. Actually, we have the release notes now. Yeah, they came out like I think a day ago or so. We can actually check if they said any, because I haven't read all of them yet. So I don't know if that's something specifically that they addressed, that specific interaction. So let's just scroll all the way down to the generics. And Hack to Reality, right? Only aura cards controlled by the hero that was hit and have a cost property with a value of X or less can be chosen. Yeah, okay, it doesn't say anything specifically about that interaction. So I suppose we have to wait for like a judge ruling on that. I might post that on the judge Discord and then try to get a like actual ruling on this from like a L2 judge or something. I would say it works. In my opinion, I think that works because the dagger counts as a hit, and this doesn't specify what needs to hit. It just says hit. So it could be your attack, it could be a flick dagger, it could even be an ally. And so you could run this in Dromai or in New Prism and use an angel or a dragon to hit, and it would still work, I think, in my opinion. So this card...
Hit a hero, but yeah.
Yeah, you hit a hero, but I mean, like, you could attack with a dragon, and then when that dragon hits, it still counts.
Yeah,
right?
I thought it the other way around.
Yeah, sure. The other way it wouldn't work, right? Because it needs to hit a hero, so that's true. But this is a card that I could see having some potential in the right meta, but it's very dependent on what that meta looks like. So let's see how it shakes out.
It's also Prism, yellow.
It's a yellow, yeah.
Nice for your tech cards.
Yep, that's not bad. If your tech cards aren't reds, right, you have a little more resources to play with. It only blocks 2, so that's a bit of a letdown. But again, if the meta looks the right way, I could see this being a tech piece that you can bring in. Maybe not as a 3-off, but as like a 1 or 2-off, where it's like a specific tech piece that you have in the sideboard. I could see that being a relevant card, but it all depends. We'll have to see how it works out. Also, the art in that is fantastic. They've done that a lot on a couple of wizard cards where they have this like really trippy artwork, right? That just looks like something straight out of a LSD trip. That's pretty cool. I like that. And then the last one, no, actually we have 2 more. We've got Warmonger's Diplomacy.
The multiplayer one.
The multiplayer one, yes. I'm really like, there's a mechanic in Magic the Gathering, which is called, I think it was
what does it do?
Tribunal or something, where each player votes for something.
Yeah, some cards you vote like.
Some cards have that where each player votes on something, and then the thing that has the most votes happens. This works a little different because each player gets to decide what they want to do. And this is another card that I could see maybe making its way into some sideboards for like more control-oriented decks, because it's a blue that doesn't cost anything and it blocks 3. So that's a great start for a blue. If it blocks 3, that's good. And there's a couple of decks that really get kind of annoyed by this, specifically Runeblades. Really have a hard time dealing with this because they typically want to do both, but it can also shut down a couple of other decks, right? Like if you, let's say you play this against Alexi, they basically can't play their 3 of a kind, they can't play their Codex of Frailty, so that's kind of restrictive on them. If you use this against a Brute, for example, they can't use their Bloodrush Bellows, right? If they still want to attack. So this is kind of interesting. I think the fact that it doesn't have Go Again makes it a lot worse, obviously. But I could see this making its way into very defensive, very, very fatigue-oriented lists that are just really trying to stay alive and stall the game out long enough so they can win. And there's definitely Uzuri decks that do this, right? Like the Tau Tau fatigue list, for example. I could see this maybe being played in one of those kind of lists. But I think in general for Uzuri, the card is a little too slow to really do what you need to.
I don't think so. Without Go Again, like what do you really do? For example, if you try to fatigue your opponent and you skip your turn to play this,
the thing
you're
is
down 1 card now.
You wouldn't really skip the turn, right? Like you would use this in a scenario where you blocked with a bunch of cards, and then
playing a 0-4 contract.
Yeah, you could play a 0-4 contract, sure. And then mill them in something. But if they have an arsenal lined up and they have a big disruptive turn or a big damage push on their next turn, right, that 0-4 contract isn't really gonna bother them. Whereas if you play this and they're, let's say, a Viscerai that has like a 5-card hand with a Moderate Tide into Mavrion, into Shrill, into Revel, into Rosetta or something lined up, and then if you drop this, suddenly they can't do that anymore, right? I'm not saying it's like the greatest card ever printed, right? I'm just saying I can see scenarios where this is a really relevant effect. I personally don't think those scenarios are gonna be happening often enough that this makes it into decks. But I think it's an interesting effect to see in a card, and I could see it potentially having some kind of usability in very, very slow, very grindy, very fatigue-oriented decks. But I think for the most part, it's probably going to end up being too slow and too narrow in its effect to actually do anything. I agree with you on that one.
Yeah, sure, but even if you play this, now your fatigue deck and their turn is screwed.
Yeah.
They keep the cards for next turn.
Yeah,
what are you doing with your hand then?
Yeah.
Like you want to block, now you have 4 cards in your hand?
Yep. Yeah, it's kind of...
Maybe. It's interesting effect, but...
Yeah, it's too narrow. It's too narrow in what it does in order for it to be any good. That's probably true. Okay, and then the last one we have is Poison the Well. And yeah, I guess this is another one of those where the effect is just way, way, way too specific for it to be really good, especially on a card that doesn't block. Like life gain isn't really something that's currently a thing. There was this very short window of time where we had these like weird maximum fatigue life gain Oldhim decks, and maybe into those this card would have been an interesting sideboard decision. But I think into anything that's currently being played, this is just not, you can't really include this. The effect is way too specific.
Yeah, it's unplayable at the moment, but I think the effect kinda is too good.
Mm-hmm.
If it blocks 3, like if it ever is relevant.
That's true.
Like, if I reliably hit a Vigil of Solace with it.
Yeah, I mean that's a 6 life swing that you just did. That's pretty nasty for a blue. That's true. It's just, it depends. If there's ever a hero that really has a lot of life gain, which I hope they won't do, because that's kind of like life gain is not really something that's enjoyable to play around or to play against. But if they ever do a hero that has a relevant amount of life gain built into their engine, this is a card that could see play. I could see that happening.
Yeah, but it needs to be 1 instance of life gain, and how high can it actually go without breaking like the core values of cards?
I don't think they're gonna print cards that do more than like say 3 life gain. I don't think that's gonna happen. Yeah, I think Sigil is pretty much, they've already printed the best life gain card, and anything they're gonna print is gonna be lower than that, probably in value. And then maybe they print something that gains 1 life a bunch of times, right? And then this is kind of useless against it. Yeah, I don't think we're gonna see something like, I don't know, a 3-cost healing balm that heals 6 life. I don't think that's gonna happen.
Flavorful, but
yeah, flavorful, gorgeous artwork. I love the artwork on this one. That's fantastic. Nice. But again, not a card that's really ever gonna see play, I think, unless we have a very specific situation. And so yeah, kind of, it's a little bit of a bummer that all of the generics are just kind of Like I said, Hacked Reality is maybe the only one I can see having some relevance with the right meta, and the others are just kind of not really anything you would run. So what do you think, like going forward from this, how would you change your Uzuri? How would you change the deck? What would you take out with those new cards, or rather the lack of new cards in mind?
I mean, I have a like day 0 list in mind. It only changes like 2 cards, and the 2 Odim cards go out, like Scale Peeler and Remnants are out. And in place of that, I put in the 3rd Frailty Trap. And another Spider's Bite. Another Spider's Bite, okay. So you can go double Spider's Bite into what matchup would you use that? For example, the aggro matchups like Lexi, Phi, kind of where you want to throw 1 dagger at some point, but need a Spider's Bite around for good lines even later in the game. And Nerf Couple really doesn't really do much. Because they're not running any defense reactions, Yeah. I guess that makes sense. You can have some very sick lines, especially like, for example, you were talking about Lexi earlier, how they sometimes just block 3 cards. Take a CNC. Now they can't do it, because if they block the dagger, you just throw the other one. And then your CNC still hits and gets their 3 of a kind or Art of War or whatever, Sparked Rain Razors. That makes sense, yeah. So that was one idea that I had, and I think it can be pretty good, especially with a lot of go again stuff where you can actually throw a dagger to affect your next big thing you want to connect. Yeah, so you start like with looking for a scrap, pitch a blue, throw the dagger, and then follow it up with a CNC. Exactly, something like that. And then you still have like the other Spider's Bite for Spider's Bite Death Touch lines or whatever. Right, yeah, okay. That makes sense. Yeah, okay. Very, very late. That's probably not something you do on like turn 3, I guess, yeah, but late game, I can see that being... No, and against Lexi and Fire, you can do it as early as probably turn 1. Right, because you kind of want to get rid of the... Like, you want to activate your Flick Knives, so you have the block available, right? Yeah, that's true. I've done that a couple of times into Lexi, where I just kind of flick without it doing anything. I just flick 1 dagger for 1 damage, because I'm never keeping enough hands to actually double dagger anyways. And then I just go, okay, I just flick the Nerf Scalpel. And yeah, that makes sense. Like in that situation, actually having the 2nd Spider's Bite so you can have the flick be relevant and actually do something makes sense. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So then up to 3 Frailty Traps, but I'm not sure we really need them. So that's kind of to decide it. Maybe go to on the 0 actually, because Lexi got a little bit hurt on their big turns. Yeah, with the ban on the bracers, yeah. And they might also transition to more ice focused lists. And against ice, defense reacts are actually pretty bad. True. So that's another idea to keep in mind. What to do, keep the Frailty Traps, or maybe cut them or replace them with something else. But day 0, I would just do these 2 small changes and then just take the Scale Peeler out, Van Brace out, and Spider's Bite and Frailty Trap in. Exactly. And then see how it develops from there, yeah. Yeah, I did some games against Prism already, and if nobody figures anything out that's way better, then that's not really a problem. I think it was not even close, the games we played so far.
Yeah.
So you don't really need to care about remembrance and stuff, because they can't really have an angel and a shield all the time anyway, and your daggers are already very good against the angels.
They don't have a reliable way to generate spectral shields anymore, right? Like, unless they run something like Prismatic Shield or something. Prism just makes way less spectral shields now than she did before.
Yeah.
That's true.
And that would be one of the situations where remembrance would be very good. Like, if they have a spectral shield and an angel.
Right, yeah.
But that's only happening with, like, the protection figment. And then for one time in the game, do you really want to...
Yeah, waste the sideboard slot for that.
Yeah. Flick the angel after you've cleared the spectral shield with your dagger or whatever.
Flick Knives just kind of does the same thing in this situation. Yeah, and it doesn't even cost you a resource, so that's even better. I could see maybe against Prism specifically, you could maybe switch like the blue Sedates to blue Malign. Like, it's not going to do much, but it's a must block for Prism, right? So that's maybe like a tech piece that you could bring in.
Yeah,
it's not going to... Yeah,
because Sedate is like whatever anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Like, Sedate is kind of like, you know. Inertia is nice, but in a lot of cases it doesn't really do anything, because then they just kind of play out their hand and they're, okay, I'm not having an arsenal, I guess I'm just, you know, forcing damage through this turn, fine, whatever. And then Oldhim is gone, which was like one of the matchups where Sedate, where the inertia was actually relevant, so that's kind of, doesn't matter that much. So you could kind of replace the Sedates with Maligns and just have a slightly better matchup into the new Prism, I guess. But yeah, realistically, like you said, I don't think the deck changes a lot with these new cards that we got, just because we didn't really get any new cards. And I think the meta hasn't really shifted drastically at the moment. We're still in a situation where it's like, okay, Lexi is probably still the top deck. Droma is probably still pretty high tier just because she's good into Lexi, and generally just also pretty decent into a lot of the rest of the field. Maybe there's a couple more aggressive decks now. Maybe we see a couple more ninja decks floating around now that Oldhim's gone. But that's also not terrible for us, because I think our ninja matchup is fairly decent, so that's not really an issue. Yeah, so I think Uzuri is not looking to make any like radical changes in her decks at the moment. But obviously, maybe some cracked new deck comes out. Maybe somebody figures out a way to make Prism completely stupid, or figures out a way to make Vincent extremely good, and then we have to adapt to that. But I think the beauty about Assassin is that despite only having 2 sets, it's a very flexible class. Like, we have a lot of ways to counteract specific things, and so we have a way to react to a lot of meta developments. So we're in a good spot for that.
Yeah, for sure.
Pretty interesting.
Like amnesia, overnourishing and stuff like we talked.
Yep. Because amnesia would also be great against Prism, for example, right? Because it stops cards from being heralds. So basically turns off half of her kit. If she doesn't have any more heralds, she cannot fetch figments. She cannot give her attacks go again anymore with the new Luminaris and stuff. And so that definitely would be, if Prism ends up being a big threat, definitely you could put in Amnesia, Overnourishing Emptiness here, and just have a card that's good. And also as a side effect, if people start playing more Katsu now because they expect more Illusionist, Amnesia is also great into Katsu, so that's like a double hit basically. So we have a lot of cards that we can tailor the deck with, just to counteract specific meta. So let's see where the meta develops until the Nationals, and probably the Uzuri deck that ends up being played, if it is being played, is going to look relatively similar to the decks that we currently have, with maybe like, I don't know, 5 cards or so switched out for something else. But I think other than that, the decks are going to look relatively similar.
Yeah, we have a very stable core of cards that everyone is running, and then
a couple of like personal choices, and then you basically have like the I would say 4 archetypes probably currently. Like you have the red line decks, you have your deck, which is like a red line but with blue stealth cards instead of red ones, and then without the reactions, but it's still a stealth focused list, right? With not a lot of contracts. Then you have like the contract lists, and then you have at the extreme end of that spectrum, you have something like the pure fatigue Tau contract list, where it's like, yeah, if it doesn't block 3, I don't want it in my deck.
Yeah.
And those are all valid ways to play Uzuri. That's what I love about her, right? Like she has so many different ways to play that are all actually good decks, and you can run all of those and have relevant results and have a good matchup into a lot of different heroes. So you can just kind of pick what suits your personal preference the best.
Yeah, it's funny how they kind of align on an aggressive scale after one another, like fatigue at the end, then contracts.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I'm not even sure if mine or Redline is more aggressive. Probably
I think
Redline
they're
still.
I think they're both aggressive, but in different ways, I would say. Like Redline can go taller, obviously, because you have the reactions and you can do stuff like pump and isolate up to 9 or something with an additional on-hit, so that's pretty good. And then I think this list has more ways to reliably go a little bit wider, right? Because you run the looking for a scrap, you run the give and take and stuff, so you just have a little more, and you have more blue, so you can dagger more often, right? So you have more ways to go a little bit wider. And I think Redline just has a little bit less of that, but it can go taller. So it's maybe a little better against decks that can block out really well and can use a lot of defense reactions, because you can still push over the top for those. But yeah, I think it's just, at this point, it's really just down to personal preference, right? You just have to experiment a little bit, play a couple of different decks and see what clicks the best with you, what you like the most, and then just take it from there. But she's definitely a very flexible hero with a lot of different game plans. And she's very engaging to play with because you have a ton of interaction with your opponent. That's what I love about her, right? If you compare it to an aggro deck where it's just, okay, I don't block, I just play my hand, I try to race you down as much as possible. And for Uzuri, you're always blocking. You're constantly trying to force your opponent to interact with you. And that's what I like about her the most. It's just this like interactiveness that she has. That's really cool.
But it reminds me of like one thing I wanted to actually mention, because if you want to block a lot, you should probably look at Arkan's deck or whatever.
Okay.
Because with this deck, you actually should not block that much. I mean, you still block and stuff like every assassin list blocks.
Sure.
But you should block less than with other lists.
Okay.
And I actually looked at like some of the stats, community versus myself. And you see a lot, they block a lot more.
Okay, right.
Than I do.
Okay.
Like, for example, Codex, it's 1% versus 13%. Or...
Wait, they block with Codex?
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Or even CNC, it's like 25% versus 44%.
Okay, right.
Like, a lot of cards have a huge disparity between how much I block with them and how much the community blocks with them. So I guess one advice would be, if you want to try my deck, try to block a little bit less and play the numbers game more. Like, try to connect your death touches for 8 to card 8 or whatever, instead of blocking.
Right. Okay, so the idea is kind of like, okay, maybe also dagger a little more often than you would normally do.
Yeah.
Just because you have the extra blues and you can reliably do that. But would you keep cards to dagger, actually? Because the rate just seems kind of bad at face value, right? Like keeping a card to deal 1 damage when you could have blocked with that card to prevent 3 damage. I think most people would be like, okay, this is not that great of a trade-off. So what's your stance on that?
It depends. Probably most likely not. But for example, I could see situations where you have a Death Touch in Arsenal and Tunic is ready. And a lot of people would probably just go Tunic, Death Touch. But actually keeping a blue if you have one and going Dagger, Death Touch, it's probably the correct play more often than people would think.
Okay.
Because then you keep your Tunic for other plays like take a CNC or looking for scrap and stuff.
Give and take,
and connecting Death Touch together with the point of damage that the Spider Spite did is actually 3 value as well.
That's true, because it's like 9/6. Yeah. And Dagger into Death Touch is a lot harder to block out than just naked Death Touch for a lot of decks. That's true. Yeah, that makes sense, actually, yeah. In that scenario, that you would be like, okay, rather keep the blue instead of blocking with it, and then just, you know, Dagger into Death Touch, yeah. That's true.
And then if you raise the opponent a little bit more, then the life gets lower, lower, and then the very low life total ranges, you're actually very good, because your Dagger forced them to block very weirdly.
Like if you get low enough, like the daggers themselves start to become relevant, right? You're in this kind of like Kodachi lock. It's just more expensive, obviously, but similar thing where they just need to kind of give you a card. And if they don't give you a card, even if they're not at 1 yet, right? Just the fact that whatever you could throw after the dagger gets so much harder for them to block means they often need to give you the block on the dagger itself, just to stop you from gaining that extra value. That's true. Yeah, that's pretty good insight, actually. Yeah. So, yeah, you heard it. Like, if you want to run this deck, block less than you normally would with an assassin deck. That's a good piece of advice. Again, the link to the deck is going to be down in the description. So if you want to give this deck a spin, load it up on Talishar, try it out yourself. And maybe all of the things that we went over today will give you a little bit of advice on how to navigate those games. Sebastian has gone to the trouble of putting all of the matchups into the deck itself. So you just need to click the button and you have all of the cards loaded up just the way you need them for each matchup. We've gone over a couple of changes that you might want to do with this deck going forward if you intend to play it. Like I said, I think Uzuri's positioned pretty well into the meta currently. Lexi got hit with the Bracers ban. That's pretty good for us. Oldhim's gone. That's pretty good for us, because it means aggro decks are going to be a little more relevant, and that makes the Illusionists a bit worse. So overall, I think Uzuri was a winner of this, you know, this cycle of bans and suspensions. So I think we're positioned pretty well into the coming days of Flesh and Blood. So let's see where it ends up. All right. That's it for this video. Sebastian, again, thank you for joining me here today, going over this deck. It's been a pleasure to have you on the channel. And to everyone out there, have a good day.
Bye.